Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Chakrabarty.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Professor Dugan, for that warm introduction. There you are. Thank you very much. And of course, thanks to Professor Ruby Roy Dholakia, who originally invited me to come and do this, and which in itself was an attractive proposition for me for more than one reason. An important reason being that she actually was my teacher in the business school that I attended, Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, where she was, we overlapped for a year when she finished her MBA and came back to teach us. And it was wonderful to actually then see her again after about 40 odd years or whatever. Now, I'll just ignore that letterhead there. I drafted this lecture, the basic form, when I was in Berlin last year as a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg, and I don't know how the letterhead got there. It has nothing to do with the slides. I'll go on to show. Well, I thought it would be bad form on my part to begin with a quibble with my old teacher, Professor Dholakia, who makes a tantalizing proposition on the website of this university, where they explain the Demystifying India program by saying that India is a new country, but an ancient civilization. I was very struck by it. I was actually very struck by the word "but" in that statement. It would read differently if you said India is a new country and an ancient civilization. The "but" for me was a very interesting door that wasn't fully opened, but left me wondering about all kinds of possibilities of that meaning, which gets me into the quibble that I want to carry on, not with my old teacher, Professor Dholakia, but actually with an important Indian person, Mr. Kamal Nath, who is presently the Minister of Roads and Transport in India, and who was in the previous government the Minister of Commerce and Industries, who actually went a step further than the tantalizing statement that now exists on your website, India is a young country but an ancient civilization. Kamal Nath, in a speech he gave in Columbia in 2006, actually described India as an unbeatable combination of an ancient civilization embracing economic globalization. India, an unbeatable combination of an ancient civilization embracing globalization. My quibble really is with the concatenation of these two words, civilization and globalization, because what I'm going to propose to you in my lecture tonight, that these two words are actually in tension in India, as India is evolving. In other words, the civilizational aspect of India, the legacy of that civilizational aspect is a mixed one insofar as globalization is concerned. And I'm going to, this is the argument that I'm going to develop in what I say tonight. Obviously, I'm not questioning the fact that India is a land where the Indus Valley civilization took place. India is a land where there was an ancient Tamil civilization. India is a land where there was even talk in the 19th century, particularly in South India, of India having had its share of lost continents, like the Atlantis. There was a talk that there was a continent called the Lemuria, which was lost in the seas, but which actually belonged to South India. And this became a part of Tamil nationalism in the 19th century. And my colleague at Duke, Sumati Ramaswamy, has written a wonderful book on this topic of the imagination of a lost continent. So I'm not questioning that fact. I'm simply wondering, what is the sense in which we can bring these two terms, globalization and civilization, ancient civilization together. And I actually find the word but, India is a new country, but an ancient civilization, in some ways, because it's tantalizingly ambiguous, but probably more productive than the Minister Kamal Nath's straightforward assertion that India is an unbeatable combination of an ancient civilization embracing globalization. So, to begin with, I have to, actually I don't need this microphone, I'm speaking to this one, so why am I standing there? To begin with, I have to acknowledge that the idea that India is an ancient civilization is of course not an ancient idea. Like many other historical ideas, this is a relatively young idea. It was clearly a product of the 19th century. If you go to India before the British came into 18th century India, 17th century India, you wouldn't find a scholar claiming that we are an ancient civilization. So while there had been civilizations, the claim that we are an ancient civilization is a relatively more recent claim. And the claim had to do with Indo-British cultural encounter. So in some ways, I'll spend a fair amount of this talk actually doing a potted and a quick history of the word civilization and the way it figured in colonial India, in that context of Indo-British cultural encounter. Civilization became a critical word in the vocabulary of Indian nationalism. The nationalism and the nationalist leaders, they engaged the West with the word civilization. This was very much a part of their vocabulary. I will also want to say that to think of India as an ancient civilization and to find a cultural cachet in it was something that, a cultural habit that kind of died in the 1960s. In the 1960s, with the death of our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who died in 1964, it is with his death that I mark the death of the colonial period. So even though we became independent in 47, the colonial world outlook that informed Indian nationalism kind of fades out as Nehru is gone from the scene. And then a different period begins. Civilization, interestingly, was a word that did not occur in any Indian languages. The word that we now use in Bengali or Hindi or North Indian languages to translate the word civilization, sabhyata, is actually a coinage of the 19th century. It's actually a direct translation of the English word civilization. Tagore, about whom I'm going to speak a little bit, Rabindranath Tagore, the Indian poet who got the Nobel Prize in 1913, at the very end of his life in 1941, the year he died, wrote a very interesting essay called The Crisis of Civilization, about which, again, I'll have a little more to say. But he begins this essay by remarking that we don't have a word for civilization in our languages, that the Europeans brought this word. And we know from other historians that the word in the modern sense came into use in French in the 1760s, from where it gets picked up in English and becomes the expression both in French and in English, the civilizing mission, which was one of the bases of European colonial rule in the world outside of Europe. Eventually, it is the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment who evolved a hierarchical scale of civilization, this idea that you could actually place people differentially on a scale of civilization, more civilized, less civilized, and gave the colonial enterprise its intellectual wherewithal, its intellectual backbone, as it were, for the colonial enterprise. And in that sense, civilization comes to India as part of that European vocabulary where Europeans already looked at India and China and while they regarded the Africans and the Australian Aboriginals as savages, or the Native Americans as savages, they looked at India and China and granted these cultures the status of civilization, but fallen civilization, the proposition being that they were once civilized, but now they've fallen into decay, into bad days. Indian nationalists took up that word very, very sort of seriously, did a lot of work with it. and that it's going to be a part of what I'm going to elaborate on, and made it into a weapon with which to criticize Europeans. So there's a circularity of debt here. The Europeans develop the idea of civilization. Indian nationalists pick it up. They don't necessarily agree between themselves on what actually the word means. But the word becomes a critical word. And in that sense, the use of the word, the use of the idea that we are an ancient civilization, as I was saying, is a recent idea. Between them, even though the intellectuals did not agree always on the meaning of the word civilization, but they use the word in speaking to Western intellectuals, and you can broadly say that there is a rhythm to their conversation with the West, as it were. If you think of colonialism, particularly in India, as a process of India engaging the West, India thinking about what the West meant for India, and getting the West to think about itself, and civilization is a word that figures in that process, you can see a pattern to it. And the pattern broadly was this: Indian criticisms of the West and Indian critics of the West, like Mahatma Gandhi, like Tagore, became powerful in the West only at times when Western intellectuals lost confidence in Western claims of being a superior civilization. And this happens at particular times. So if you come to the end of the 19th century, 1870 to say 1914, when the idea of progress was absolutely dominant, and Western intellectuals mostly believed in the idea of progress. And this is the time when Gandhi comes to London as a student. Or one of the people I'll talk about, Swami Vivekananda, comes to Chicago to give a speech in 1893. In this period, you will find that the people who, in the West, who were interested to listen to either Gandhi or Vivekananda, themselves came from groups that were relatively marginalized, not mainstream part of the West. So Vivekananda found his audiences mainly among women. Gandhi found his audience among vegetarians, homosexuals, Edward Carpenter, Henry Salt, all of these people. In fact, Gandhi's great-granddaughter, one of his great-granddaughters, Leela Gandhi, who is now my colleague in the English department, has written a wonderful book called Effective Colonialism or something like that, where she actually documents this process whereby in that period when Western intellectuals, mainstream, mainly male intellectuals, were absolutely sure about Western superiority, Indian criticism of the West found reception, welcome reception, in those parts of the West that were themselves marginal with respect to the mainstream of the West. So I'm mainly going to talk about, in this part of the talk, two people, Vivekananda and Tagore, and I will also touch on Gandhi and Nehru, our first Prime Minister. So my first case in point will be Swami Vivekananda, who was originally a Bengali man known as Narendranath Datta, who came to Chicago to speak at the First World Parliament of Religions in 1893, which was held at the Art Institute. In fact, Michigan Avenue, on which the Art Institute stands, part of it's now been renamed as Vivekananda Way. You find a little sign there after this man. And the letters that he actually, Vivekananda was the first exporter of Hinduism, modern Hinduism, you might say. Both one of the first makers of modern Hinduism as well as one of the first exporters of modern Hinduism to the West. He made his name, as I said, by speaking successfully at this World Parliament. And the story goes, of course, from the Indian side, it's romanticized and sometimes a little exaggerated, I assume, but the story goes that he came to this conference uninvited. He was given very little time at the end of the first day, but when he got up to speak, he apparently abandoned the stiff formality of the gathering to address his audience instead of addressing them as ladies and gentlemen, which is how they had been addressed by other speakers. Apparently, this young man got up and addressed his audience as sisters and brothers of America, and was an instant success. His representation of Hinduism in the US and Britain in the 1890s won him immediately a large number of followers in these countries. Interestingly, if you read the letters that Vivekananda wrote back home, while he was in America, you will see very clearly that he himself understood what a political word civilization was. And his use of the word itself is very political, but political in the sense of the politics of colonization. In one of the letters he writes on 6th of May 1895 to a disciple back in Madras, and he describes his own success in the United States. He says, India is now in the air, and the orthodox Christian clergy are struggling hard to put out the fire. And that's mostly men he's talking about. And he then goes on to say, and this is where you will see how he uses the word civilization. He goes on to say, if you could send and maintain for a few years a dozen well-educated, strong men you have to notice, to preach in Europe and America, you would do immense service to India, both morally and, he says, politically. This is long before Indians think of independence. There's some notion of politics, cultural politics, which has to do with civilization. Many of the Western people think of you as a nation of half-naked savages. See, that's the scale of civilization that I was talking about. And therefore only fit to be whipped into civilization. And that's, if you 300 millions become cowed by the missionaries, what can one man do in this distant land? And you can again see that there are two takes on civilization. When the Westerners apply the word civilization to us, we are being whipped into the state of civilization, because we are not seen as civilized but savages. But when we speak to them of our civilization, we criticize them. And civilization becomes a potent word in my vocabulary. That's the kind of exchange that's set up. Yet, as I was saying, for all the charm of the success that the Swami wrote home about, the fact remains that an overwhelming majority of the people in the West who actually accepted and felt drawn towards the teaching of Vivekananda were women and not men. Probably you could surmise many of these Western women used the alternative models of masculinity that Vivekananda's personality and teachings offered them to critique men of their own society. But it's not a subject I'm going to go into, but you can see that it's his alternative masculinity that appealed to them. But much recent research supports the conclusion that his appeal was mostly among women. And in fact, there's quite a bit of telling evidence, even in what he himself wrote at the time. So let me go on to so that's Swami Vivekananda. And that's how he's usually pictured. So here is a letter I'm reading out that Vivekananda wrote to Madras again, to his disciple in Madras, 20th August 1893. And he says, from this village, written from Massachusetts, from this village I'm going to Boston tomorrow. I'm going to speak at a big ladies' club there. I must first go and buy some clothing in Boston. If I am to live longer here, my quaint dress will not do. People gather by the hundreds on the streets to see me. So what I want is to dress myself in a long black coat and keep a red robe and a turban to wear when I lecture. This is what the ladies advise me to do. So what he's wearing is on the advice of American women. This is what the ladies advise me to do, and they are the rulers here, and I must have their sympathy. Or take another letter. This is dated 2nd November 1893, which when Vivekananda reproduces in his letter a newspaper report of one of his lectures. And it said, the newspaper said, ladies, 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 packing every place, filling every corner. They patiently waited and waited while the papers that separated them from Vivekananda were read. In fact, a contemporary American observer, a Mrs. S.K. Blodgett, who was present at the Parliament of Religions when Vivekananda opened his maiden speech by addressing, as I said, the assembled gathering as my sisters and brothers of America, had this to say of women's immediate reaction to the Hindu monk. And she wrote, when that young man got up and said, sisters and brothers of America, 7,000 people rose to their feet as a tribute to something they knew not what. When it was over, I saw hundreds of women walking over the benches to get close to him. And I said to myself, well, my lad, if you can resist that onslaught, you're indeed a god. So if it was the ladies of the West and not the gentlemen who received Vivekananda's criticism of the West enthusiastically, the situation, as I said, was not all that different from Gandhi when he first came to London in the 1880s, a few years before Vivekananda, as a student. So his affiliations were with the vegetarians, with the homosexuals, again, people marginal. And I'm saying this is because it's a period when the confidence of Western male intellectuals in the superiority of the West is at its extreme. This is the period that the Indian author Ashish Nandy has written about beautifully in a book called The Intimate Enemy, where he actually plays around with the character of Rudyard Kipling and talks about how when Kipling is growing up, until he's about 6, when he's sent back to England, he is mainly brought up by Indian servants. And there's a lovely Indian femininity that he develops, which then has to be stamped out of him by schooling in England. And Nandi develops this interesting thesis that the job of the public schools in England was to produce men who exuded what Nandi calls hyper-masculinity, that then they would then project back to the colonized to keep them under the spell of their power. It is only after the First World War, if you think of books like Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, 1919 or thereabouts, it's after the First World War that the idea of progress receives a huge, big setback in the West, and Western intellectuals begin to question if the West really is morally superior to the East, and if the West has the moral right. Now, there's a lot of evidence of this amongst philosophers' writings, in literature, but let me just read out to you a letter that's written in June 1923 by the very eminent English political philosopher, Harold Lasky, who actually used to have tons of Indian students work with him, do their PhDs. This is the letter that Lasky wrote to his friend Felix Frankfurter, a Harvard professor and later a judge in the Supreme Court of this country. And this is what Lasky says as an English intellectual in 1923. He says, "The truth is, dear Felix, that we ought not to stay in India. Literally and simply, we are not morally fit to do the job. On all of which, please read E.M. Foster's A Passage to India. I have my grave doubts whether the Indians can govern themselves." Reasonable doubts, I don't doubt that doubt. "But it is better for them to make efforts than to have this running sore at the heart of things. If they fail, let it be their failure. Our success, if it were not too late, would only deepen their sense of inferiority." And you can see in this letter a Western intellectual actually questioning whether they have the right to do this. It was in this period, therefore, it's not surprising that it's actually in the interwar period, the two people whom I consider the two best, that's another picture of Vivekananda, by the way, the two people I consider the best products of Indo-British cultural encounter, Gandhi and Tagore, that they become accepted critics of the West, accepted in the West, that is. And that happens in the interwar period. I mean, it's in the interwar period that Gandhi is able to mobilize the confidence to say to a Western reporter, the famous quip about Western civilization, when he's asked what he thought of Western civilization, saying that it would be a good idea. But that is 1930, in this period, that he can actually say it with authority. But interestingly, what is noticeable is that Tagore and Gandhi, while very close, were often in disagreement. Close enough so that actually the epithet Mahatma, the title Mahatma for Gandhi, was actually given by Tagore. But they disagreed on the meaning of civilization. So if you read Gandhi's book Hind Swaraj, which he wrote in 1909, that is Hind Swaraj meaning self-rule for India, which he always swore by, there's a chapter called Civilization, where he follows Edward Carpenter in calling it a disease. For him, civilization meant industrial civilization, which, as you know, he called a disease. Tagore, on the other hand, did not think of industrial civilization or scientific civilization based on science as a disease. So I'm simply mentioning that to make the point that while civilization was a critical weapon with which Indians would beat the West, they were not in agreement about what the word meant. And that is the richness, both the ambiguity and the expansiveness of the word. So for Tagore, on the other hand, civilization meant something else. When he wrote Crisis in Civilization, what he meant was that for him, civilization was that cultural formation. And I'm now putting it in my terms, not his, but I'll soon tell you why I'm drawing this conclusion out of his writings. For Tagore, civilization was the cultural formation that actually furnished from within itself the tools with which to criticize itself and made a gift of those tools to the people who felt oppressed by that civilization. So civilization for Tagore, and I think Gandhi would agree with it from all that I've read of Gandhi, civilization was a self-reflexive stance on the world. To be civilized was to have the capacity for self-criticism. And therefore, a nation or a culture or a group was civilized only if only if they wielded power in such a way that they furnished from within themselves the weapons of the weak, as Jim Scott would call them. And that comes out in Tagore's both his essay, The Crisis of Civilization, and also what he wrote elsewhere. Crisis of Civilization was 1941. The war had started. And Tagore was deeply disappointed. And he wrote in that essay, I had at one time believed that the springs of civilization would issue out of the heart of Europe. I must here, share with you, as a historian of India or a student of Indian history, something that is quite both amusing and amazing about Indian nationalism. For a long time, this is there in Nehru's Discovery of India, in Tagore's writings, and many, Neeraj Chaudhary's writings, Indians used to believe that there were two kinds of Englishmen, good and bad. And they used to think the bad ones came out to India and the good ones stayed back at home. Because when Indian students went to England to study in the 19th century, early 20th century, they seldom actually came across racism. They came across racism much more in India. Nehru talks about two kinds of Englanders, the Englanders who come out to India and the Englanders who stay back home. And when the war breaks out, because some of these Indian leaders so deeply believed in the idea of European civilization, this war was a heartbreak for them. So Tagore actually said, but today when I'm about to quit the world, my faith that civilization would spring from Europe, my faith has gone bankrupt altogether. But interestingly then in the next sentence he resolves not to lose his faith in man thereby. He says, that may have happened, but I'm not going to lose my faith in man. And in the following sentence, he gives the example of a human being who actually helps him to preserve his faith in man. And the example is none other than the Englishman, Charles Freer Andrews, who gave his life to the cause of Indian nationalism. And Tagore actually throughout his life kept this idea, preserved this idea, and I think again this is an idea with which many Indians would have agreed then, that what made Europe a civilization was the fact that Europe was able to criticize its own cruelties, its own sins, as it were. I mean, not very different from, if you think about it, from what somebody like Frantz Fanon would say in a later period. Again, I'm quoting Tagore, we have witnessed from distance, talking about Spanish-English relations, we have witnessed from this distance how actively the British statesmen acquiesced in the destruction of the Spanish Republic. On the other hand, he says, we also noted with admiration how a band of valiant Englishmen laid down their lives for Spain. Or in another lecture, he would say in 1934, we have seen Europe, and this clinches my point about Tagore's idea of civilization, we have seen Europe cruelly unscrupulous. We have seen Europe being cruelly unscrupulous in its politics and commerce, widely spreading slavery over the face of the earth in various names and forms. And yet, in this very Europe, protest is always alive against its own iniquities. So that, for me, summarizes the Indian nationalist understanding of what it meant to be civilized. Civilization, as I was saying, is a reflexive stance. Civilization means that I wield power in such a way that I actually give weapons to those whom I oppress with which they will actually criticize me, or the weapons they will use against me. In that sense, European imperialism was a very, very interesting phenomenon, perhaps quite unique. It's very different from superpower politics in that sense, because imperialism was based on a civilizational stance of domination. As I was saying, this idea that India was an ancient civilization in a way died after the coming of independence. For many reasons. As I said, it died in the 60s really. But you could read correspondence between Gandhi and Nehru in 1946, and you can see Nehru pressing for modernization. For Gandhi, the acme of Indian civilization was the village. And there's a letter he writes to Nehru in 45, where he says, when I talk about villages, I'm not talking about the villages you see around you. I'm talking about villages with libraries. I'm talking about villages with universities, but villages. I don't want big cities with hundreds and thousands of people, then you can't get away from violence. Nehru gives an answer saying, a village, Nehru writes back to Gandhi in 45, normally speaking, is backward intellectually and culturally, and no progress can be made from a backward environment. We have to encourage the village to approximate more to the culture of the city. It also died because this was happening by the end of the British rule, but also after independence, the lower castes were coming up in political power, in their own self-awakening. And they were saying that, look, the texts that you use and describe as the texts of Indian civilization are all written by upper castes, if not by Brahmins. They don't talk about us. So the population of India, the majority of Indians, were rejecting the idea of civilization. And it was going because of modernization. And also, over time, the West eventually lost, and I'll come to that, any capacity to represent itself as either a civilization or a superior civilization. I mean, it's part of the story of democratization of both India and the world, but also a story about modernization. Remember in the 50s, the big people were talking about, Rostow was talking about economic takeoff. We were reading about Rostow in India. James Burnham was talking about the managerial revolution. That's what we were reading about. Galbraith and other people were talking about socialism and capitalism coming together. But the paradigm was modernization. So in a book that's fascinating for the analysis it does, my friend Sunil Khildani, the book is called The Idea of India. It was published when India became 50, on the 50th year of Indian independence. Sunil Khildani claims that if you look at Nehru, and that's Gandhi and Nehru, that if you look at Nehru, you realize that while he grew up under the mentorship of Gandhi and grew up imbibing this nationalist use of civilization, he actually made India modern by breaking with all the myth-making that nationalism had done about India's past, like the idea that India was a great civilization. And it was Indian democracy, that the decision that Nehru and his cohorts of nationalists made to make India into a democracy that we know, to introduce into India universal adult franchise when most Indians were non-literate, was an act of breaking from the past of Indian nationalism itself. And I want to submit to you that while civilization as a paradigm, as a way of looking at things died, there was one lasting legacy of the nationalist use of civilization that Khildani misreads in his book. And the legacy was this. Indians, where Gandhi included, were actually asking for universal adult franchise from 1921 on. In fact, Indian revolutionaries with whom the British saw as terrorists, working in Britain around 1908, were already asking for universal adult franchise. You know what's fascinating about Indians demanding vote for everybody in the early part of the 20th century? What's fascinating is the fact that they'd all grown up on John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill clearly says there cannot be universal adult franchise without universal adult education. But Indians, 80% of Indians were non-literate. The basis on which Indian leaders could ask for democracy for India was their acceptance of the idea of civilization. Because they were actually saying our peasantry may be illiterate, but we have had an ancient civilization. The people are civilized, and civilized people are capable of becoming citizens. You know, it's a fascinating experiment. There's a great book on French history called From Peasants into Frenchmen by Eugene Weber. And he actually documents the process through which the peasant almost has to die in order to become the industrial person who will then become the citizen. If you read histories of citizenship in the Western European context, in English context, you will get the story that once there was a peasant-based England, then there was industrialization. Industrialization converts the peasant into the worker fights for rights, becomes a citizen. In India and in many other places, the opposite happens. The peasant becomes a citizen overnight. The argument prepared over a few decades, from 20s on, is very clearly articulated by Radhakrishnan, who becomes later one of our presidents, a philosopher, in the debates in the Indian Constituent Assembly, where he says, you know, the idea of republicanism is not foreign to our genius. It was part of our ancient civilization. And you know why? Around 1914 or 1911, I think, in Mysore, somebody chanced upon an old manuscript, which is now famous, called Arthashastra, which was an ancient Sanskrit text about rulership and how to rule people, about statecraft. Once they found it, if you look at what Indians were writing in the 1920s, tons of books like Local Self-Government in India, Republican Tradition in India. People will say, oh, we have got our Machiavelli, you know, come on, we have our own political thought. All part of nationalism. And I'm simply saying that without that argument that the Indian peasant is civilized and therefore capable of exercising citizens' rights, without that argument, Nehru and his friends would not have been able to introduce mass democracy in India as we now know it today. So in that sense, I'm modifying what Sunil Khilnani was arguing a little bit by saying that the establishment of adult vote-based democracy in India is not a departure from the nationalist past. It is something for which the ground was laid by Indian nationalism. And the idea of civilization, even though the idea declines in the 60s, has left us that as a legacy. Now I move to the final part of my talk. And the question is, if that was the legacy of our civilization, of the civilizational discourse in India, the Indian democracy, today when we think of globalization, is that an unmixed legacy? I go back to the point, my critique, my quibble with the Indian Minister Kamal Nath, who says India is an unbeatable combination of an ancient civilization embracing globalization. Because interestingly, when you read globalization literature, when you read economists who are now talking about what does India need to do in order to become capitalist even faster, in order to catch up with China, in order to be a superpower, you will see that all of them agree that if India wants to generate huge amounts of employment for unskilled people, not for computer guys, not for back offices, and not for the IT revolution, but because the IT revolution brings in a lot of revenue, it doesn't generate that much employment. You know, 90% of Indian labor force are actually employed in the informal sector. So when these economists ask themselves, what does India need to do? It's very interesting what they find as an obstacle. You know, one of the obstacles they find is labor laws. And then they discover that India invented in 1950s labor laws that were totally copies of the laws of the most advanced industrialized countries. In other words, Indian leaders decided that whether India was industrialized or not, the Indian workers should get nothing short of the rights that the workers in advanced countries had obtained after years of both industrialization and fighting for those rights. Why? Because just as they decided that Indians deserved the citizenry right from the beginning because we were civilized, they also decided that we were not going to have industrialization through a period of ugly class warfare where workers have to be disadvantaged initially in order for everybody to become prosperous later. We would make the workers prosperous and then have industrialization. So our political thought was far in advance of our economic institutions. What was the result? We didn't industrialize. Capitalists were not interested in that game. So now when they're interested, there's a huge struggle on their hands, which has to do with the recognition that we have labor laws that are not helpful for capitalist growth because they give the workers too many privileges. They make it hard for you to lay off people. They make it hard for you to downsize companies. And then they go back and they discover, there's a wonderful essay that P.C. Mohalanavis, who was Nehru's most preeminent statistician and the planner of the Indian Second Plan, wrote in 1969 somewhat ruefully, saying that we made a mistake. We actually went ahead of ourselves. We assumed that we had already become industrial and gave workers rights that we shouldn't have given. And now the workers don't want to give up those rights. And therefore you get voices like B.K. Nehru, actually a cousin of the Prime Minister Nehru and a very important distinguished civil servant, who wrote an essay in 1997 in an Indian magazine saying, look, we have to acknowledge that this democracy was a mistake. If England had obtained democracy, he says in that article, during the time when Robin Hood was there, surely Robin would have become the Prime Minister of England, but would that have been good for England? But the point is, you see, this is where I'm saying there's a tension between people who want to globalize, embrace globalization, and the heritage of thinking civilizationally. And that's why I like the but in Professor Dholakia's. It said, young country, but a civilization, but is much more tantalizing. It can work out either way. But the proposition that it's an ancient civilization embracing globalization is much more problematic because it completely overlooks the tension between the two. So, to actually then to come to the question of where the West is in all this, where the West figures in Indian debates about globalization, I mean, India has a huge problem. I mean, that political legacy, which is the legacy of the civilizational talk, is very hard to get rid of. B.K. Nehru may want to change Indian democracy. It's not going to happen easily because people actually in India, one of the interesting things is that people come out and vote. The poor vote. So you have to remember the poor. It's very difficult to forget the poor. There's an interesting advertisement put out recently featuring a very well-known Indian film star, Amitabh Bachchan, on the Bombay-Worli Sea Link, the new kind of sea bridge they've built. And he stands on that bridge and he walks the length of the bridge. And in that ad, he says, you know, there is one India that's poised to go places, to go to Mars, do wonderful things, but it's on a leash. And then he says, the leash is the other India. And you can read it two ways, you know. You can read it him saying that the leash must go and the other India must join this India. Or you can also read him as saying this India that's poised to go further must forget the other India, break away from the leash and go somewhere else. And that tension, what to do with the poor, is at the heart of debates about Indian globalization. Now, if you go back and what I want to go to, well, I'll go back to that a little later. I want to finish by showing you one example of a cultural debate in India and how it works out these days, and which is partly about globalization. It's about Western culture. It's about the media. It's about consumption. And it will actually help us to come back and conclude on this topic of what does it mean to be civilized on this question. So, earlier this year, in February, was Valentine's Day. And, you know, one of the things that's happened in India is, of course, Christmas Day, Valentine's Day, these have become very, very popular in the urban places. And there have also been protest movements against it. And what happened this year was interesting, that in many Indian cities, but I'm going to talk about one, particularly in the state of Karnataka and where Bangalore is, the Indian Silicon Valley is, and where the Hindu right party BJP rules, this debate about Valentine's Day broke into kind of violent sort of activities. On 24th January 2009, a bunch of hoodlums, I have to call them hoodlums in my judgment, belonging to a self-styled Hindu outfit called the Ram Sene, warriors of the mythical king, God King Rama, attacked young women who were visiting a pub in the town of Mangalore in Karnataka. And this is, unfortunately, is a bad, I just downloaded them from the internet. So this is actually a picture taken by television. Sometimes citizens take them on their mobile and post it. The pictures are often bad, but this is the attack on the pub. Interestingly, media has become so critical to vandalism in India that last year, a bunch of students in Delhi University wanted to protest about the inclusion in their syllabus of an essay by a very well-known Indian poet, Ramanujan, who used to teach in my department in Chicago, South Asian department, who's dead now, very well-regarded man. They included an essay by him on the Ramayana. And some right-wing Hindu students didn't like it. They wanted to vandalize the office of the head of the department of Delhi University. But you know what they did? They first called up the television, waited for the cameras to come, and then started vandalizing. People have become so aware of what role the media plays, and it's part of how India is globalizing. So I don't know if these people did the same thing, but this is the picture of a woman, actually young woman, crying, having been beaten up. This is all to do with vandalism to Valentine's Day. And the man who led it, whose picture I'll show you, was a man called Pramod Muthalik, who had once worked in the Indian army, who was associated with Hindu right politics. Muthalik eventually apologized for beating up women. And he came on television, he apologized, but not for the attack on pubs and other things that he considers foreign to Indian culture. So you can see now the West becomes part of lifestyle, consumption. The West has no moral status. So when he's saying it's foreign to Indian culture, he doesn't mean African. He means it's Western. His next program, he announced, would be to resist the celebration of Valentine's Day as un-Indian. He said his group would forcibly abduct and marry off people, young couple found being romantic in public, which fortunately they didn't carry out. In a television interview with CNN, IBN, he actually said, why should one declare one love only one particular day in the year? Because in India, we love our wives every day of the year. Obviously because in the West, they only love in one day of the year. And there's been violence before. I'm just taking one example. And you know what happened? Indian feminists this time, formed an alliance called Consortium of Pub-Going Loose and Forward Women. And these women, they started a campaign for collecting pink women's underwear, pink-colored women's underwear, and sending them to Muthalik and his men. And their aim was to collect 3,000 such underwears. They ended up collecting 30,000 such underwears and sent them all to Muthalik. And what they did was also to put advertisement in the English language newspapers, and they put an animation in one of the newspapers, which I'm going to show you now. So this is called the Pink Chaddi campaign. Chaddi is the word for women's underwear. So this says, this Valentine's Day, send the Sri Ram Sena a pink chaddi, because chaddis are forever. And this was the anime. So that's Muthalik. Now, this is one incident among many. And I went to this business school, as I was telling you. Most of my friends there, particularly people who did marketing, specialized in marketing, would do random sampling, stratified random sampling. And then when I became a historian, even today they tease me by saying, Dipesh, historians generalize on the basis of a sample size of 1. So this is a sample size of 1. I'm not going to generalize. But what I invite you to do with me is to read it symptomatically, as it were. In other words, read it for the symptoms of what it says about cultural debates in India. As I said, it's not an exceptional case. There are many other cases like that. So if you think about it now, it's about lifestyle. It has so many things in it. Women's sexuality as an affront. And I was saying to the class this morning that women's sexuality has always been a disputed part of any kind of modernity. But what I find interesting is the differences between the civilizational talk about lifestyle and this talk about lifestyle. Obviously, the feminists are defending their rights for lifestyle. So if you go back to my earlier slides, go back to my nationalists, all these people, Vivekananda, Tagore, Gandhi, Nehru, they're all distinctive for their sartorial inventiveness. All of them produced designed clothes for themselves. With the help of American women, in Vivekananda's case, yes. But, however, before Gandhi decided to wear his loincloth, there was 1 month he devoted to thinking about what he should wear. But the interesting thing was that lifestyle politics, so they were in nationalist politics, civilizational politics, was all about lifestyle. But the lifestyle, the idea of the lifestyle was an inclusive lifestyle. They all dressed in such a way so that they included the poor. The poor could identify with them. Whereas lifestyle for these feminists is, of course, much more individualistic and much more, it's much more in-your-face kind of feminism. Literally, so forgive the pun. But, when I first showed these slides in Berlin, there was an interesting German woman, young woman in my audience, who said to me, you don't notice that the humor of this is not just about revenge, there's a queer humor going on. He says, queer feminists make these kind of humorous jokes all the time, and you've missed out on it. I may have, I acknowledge that. I was grateful for that criticism. But my point, what I was trying to say, was that if you look at this as symptomatic of cultural debates in India, what do you see? You see actual violence on one case, Mutalik and his people not wanting to allow women to do what they want to do. And on the other hand, you get a desire to gag the person you disagree with. This may have been queer humor, but it's also a symbolic gagging of Mutalik, which is why he gets stuffed in his throat with a pink chaddi. And this is absolute absence of dialogue between people who disagree. So I come back to the question of civilization. Civilization, as I was saying, following Gandhi and Tagore then, civilization is the act of being self-reflexive. Civilization is the act of giving the person whom I oppress, who I end up oppressing, the tools with which they will criticize me. India and China desire to be superpowers. And I say to my Indian friends and my Chinese friends, there is no benign superpower. One shouldn't be naive to think that a superpower can be benign. If you're a big tree and you fall, you kill other little plants. You can't be big without squeezing and squashing somebody. And I say to them, so in your imagination of being a superpower, how will you hold and wield this power? What resources will you mine to create the tools with which those who feel oppressed by you will criticize you? How will you create that freedom? Now that is, for me, is a legacy of the old idea of civilization. The idea of civilization with which Indians criticized Europe. And that legacy, as I was telling you, that legacy produced Indian democracy. That legacy produced a kind of culture of respect for labor, which the globalizing economists and others now rationally criticize. The globalization argument is that we need laws that will make it easier for business people to make labor suffer, give them lower wages in the short run so that everybody benefits in the long run. Right? Whereas civilizational thinking thought, we will simply usher in this utopian India. And therefore I end by saying that India is not an unbeatable combination. India doesn't come to us as already packaged, as an unbeatable combination of an ancient civilization embracing globalization. To create that unbeatable combination is our task of the future. Thank you very much.
Well, I know that Dipesh gave me a very different definition of civilization, something to really think about. We will be asking questions, but before that, may I invite Max to come up on the behalf of the class?
Oh,
On behalf of the honors colloquium class here at the University of Rhode Island, I'd like to thank Dr. Chakrabarty for a great presentation.
Thank you very much.
It was very insightful. We had a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Now we would like the questions to be asked, if you have any. We have put a microphone up front, and because we are webcasting this event, we would really appreciate if you would come up to the microphone and ask the question. And while the microphone is getting ready, I also want to remind you that the speaker next week is Dr. Nadler, who will talk about Gandhi, and his topic is, in fact, what will Gandhi globalize? It'll very nicely follow tonight's lecture. So with that,
Yes. Before we had the term globalization, what would you say Gandhi's role was in South Africa, working on behalf of the Indian workers there? Is that globalization? And if so, is it English globalization or Indian globalization?
I wish we could have Gandhi here to answer that question, but I'll have to speak on his behalf. Gandhi's one of the fascinating things about the Phoenix ashram in South Africa, when you read about it, is how many people came from different parts of the world to live with him. And I think Gandhi was always an internationalist and a universalist. He went back to India. You know, I mean, Gandhi, along with Freud, is one of those few people whose careers actually take off after they're 50. And he comes back to India when he's 50. And I think he comes back to India because he's Indian, but also he realizes that India will magnify his message to the world, given the situation. But it was surely a spirit of universalism that animated his spirit, his own thinking. And see, there have been, I mean, globalization, people who work on globalization will tell you, there have been waves of globalization before. People have come together. Regions have come together. As historians, you would make probably distinctions between different kinds of globalization.
I have a question about, again, globalization, but more or less back to the civilization. You talked earlier about how poverty was kind of the leash holding back India from achieving many great things, like going to Mars and things. But back to how we can globalize and try and get to the root of that problem with poverty. I remember back in class you also said how India has a trend of not going from rags to riches, but making a jump straight from rags to riches. Now, when we're forcing civilization, the West, on India, it's more of a sense of working that way up the chain from rags to riches. That's not exactly what one of the stereotypes would be for India. So how do we find this kind of medium in between the two that might actually work out for India in trying to tackle this poverty problem?
I mean, the thing to realize is, you know, people who are against globalization, people who are for globalization, both sets of people are against poverty. I mean, nobody will come out and say, I want India to remain poor. I mean, it's possible that some elements of the middle class sometimes wish that the poor were not there to hold India back. But the difference is that the globalizing economists I was talking about, without naming them, their idea is that we have somehow given the poor too many rights before we have built the economic institutions to actually underpin those rights, right? And that's the argument that I was saying, that for them, the point that these rights were given to the poor because there was a bunch of leaders who believed in the idea of India being a civilized country. and there should be civility in society, that there should be dialogue, there should be self-reflexivity. It was those leaders that, for them, that becomes a difficult legacy. It becomes a liability. Whereas there are other people who wants to, again, get rid of poverty, but not by asking labor to make more sacrifices in the short term than they've already made. Right? So I'm sort of saying that what has happened now, that because of the urge to globalize and because of the debates of globalization, civilization has become a much more mixed legacy than it once was. And that's what I thought the minister's statement wasn't acknowledging enough, that there's a tension between the civilizational legacy and the needs of globalization. And to create a civilized, globalized India that will be both civilized and globalized is the task of the future.
Dr. Chakrabarty, my question for you, you have talked about some of the perils of being a superpower. And I'll tell you a little bit about what I read into that. But I'd like for you to talk about some of those perils and whether or not there is any advice that you would give the existing superpower, the United States. And in general, where do you see this, this tension between the West and the East taking the world? That's two separate questions.
No, I mean, that's a good question. I make a distinction between imperial power that the Europeans built up over 500 years and the model of the superpower. And there's a phase in the 50s and 60s when you can see America exactly holding a ground in between these two. And I'll tell you why. I mean, when I read letters that Prime Minister Nehru wrote to Indian chief ministers in the 50s after becoming the prime minister, and this was a time when Nehru intellectually was closer to socialism in his own preferences. And and this is before, obviously, civil liberties movement, civil rights movement, he constantly describes American society as the most progressive society in the world. So somewhere, I mean, Americans themselves had the idea that the mantle of managing the world was falling on their shoulders because the British Empire was going. And even in India, there was this understanding that as a country that deeply valued democracy, and therefore was deeply open to the charge of self-contradiction in terms of slavery, in terms of denying civil rights. This was the society that kind of was carrying on the legacy of civilization because there was enough self-reflexivity. And I'm saying that America and the West generally has lost that ground, partly because they've used the word democracy in bad faith. They've used the word freedom in bad faith. They have upheld unfreedoms in the name of freedom, done things. And that's part of the story of the decline of the word civilization.
Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank you for a very, very stimulating talk. My question really is about the historical context of a lot of the things you're talking about. I've been reading Giovanni Origi's book, The Long 20th Century,
Right.
and actually in Janet Abdul-Lagood's work before that, you could actually make the argument that globalization goes back and actually has a continual stream of flows back to the Mongol Empire as far as India is concerned and so on. And, I'm wondering if the specific tension you refer to, if you could situate that within the current period, specifically with respect to neoliberalism.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because you're seeing now in Latin America that democracy was all fine and good as long as it was right-wing democracy, but now that Latin America, for example, is becoming, rejecting the Washington Consensus, that even there, democracy now, in the Honduran case, you can see this, is now, there's all kinds of justifications for getting rid of democracy.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if that's really not what's going on. And the other part of my question is whether or not terms like globalization, modernity, democracy, and so on aren't being used as almost politically loaded rhetorical tropes between different factions contesting for power in terms of the internal politics of India.
Yeah. No, thank you for the question. It's a complex question, so let me pick out some of the strands in it. First of all, with respect to words, I mean, one of, as you would know, that the price of a word becoming very powerful in general parlance is that it loses precision in meaning. I mean, any word that becomes powerful gets used in so many ways that it's very hard to then legislate and say, this is the meaning you must put up on it. So, and that's what was happening with civilization in my presentation, that Gandhi and Tagore would disagree and agree. It was a capacious word, and that's why it was a powerful word. But coming back to globalization, I think it seems to me that, of course, there's, you can read Janet Abdul-Lugod and Arrighi and these people. One needs to distinguish between different kinds of globalization. And I totally agree with you that the globalization I'm talking about is the one that is associated with neoliberal economic policies. So in India, this globalization is actually dated from 1991, when economic reforms took place. And even today, one of the most interesting tensions, and this is the tension between civilizational side and the globalization side in the neoliberal sense, that people talk about there being tension between Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Sonia Gandhi. Because Prime Minister is a hard-headed economist, and he doesn't want to adopt populist measures, or measures that he sees as populists. Whereas Sonia Gandhi is a politician and comes up with all kinds of measures of welfare. They've made an act that everybody has the right to wages for 100 days in the year. Right? And that the economists see as a tremendously wasteful populist measure. And you see that in the political discourse. So on the one hand, economists, sometimes I'll meet economist friends and they say, in India, we have to do reforms by stealth. When the democracy is asleep, let's get some acts through, when people are not watching. And at the same time, you'll have somebody like Rahul Gandhi, Mrs. Gandhi's son, going around saying growth must be inclusive. So there's a tremendous political debate about globalization in India, which I'm boiling down to this phrase about, do you remember the poor or not? Right? Do you pass them by? Do you ask them to suffer now so that they do better later? Or do you actually go and seek their votes and pander to them? And that tension between whether you remember the poor or forget the poor is the tension in my terms between the civilizational legacy, which was all about remembering the poor and including them in your politics of lifestyle, and what I'm calling globalization, which is much more associated with neoliberal globalization as well as mediatization, the coming of a certain images of the West through the media. And even if you look at the little story I told you about the Valentines Day, you can see that within India there's now broadly amongst the 200 million or so people who consume, there's an agreement on consumption that we should consume. But there's not an agreement on who will consume. Should women consume as much as men do? So this whole question of sexuality, lifestyle, comes up in a very, very different way. And you can see that the West has no civilizational presence in that discourse. And I was also pointing to how there's an absence of dialogue between oppositions.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah.
Before, come on up and ask the mic. I forgot to announce that we do have books, including Provincializing Europe, copies of that outside, and Dipesh will sign them. If you would like to purchase one, the bookstore has copies of the books available.
A lot of what you said tonight was really interesting news to me, so thanks for a very enlightening talk. I was particularly interested in the debate that you talked about between Gandhi and I think it was Nehru about whether or not India should try and develop very livable small villages or large kind of productive city centers.
Right.
And I was wondering if that debate still exists and if there's still sort of movements towards a more livable village system.
That's very interesting. The debate has been won by the cities. If you look at India today, the statistics, most people leave villages and are crowding into the cities, which is why the cities are bursting at the seams. So in fact, what Gandhi dreaded is actually what has happened. And it's produced other sorts of problems. But you also have to remember that I was saying that internally within India, the people who were most vocal in their criticism of Gandhi and their criticism of Gandhi as ideas of civilization were the ex-untouchable people, the utterly low-caste people who suffered in the villages. And they actually would say, all this talk about civilization is romanticism by upper caste people. Right? So the village lost on two counts, you know. It lost on the count of modernization that Nehru was pushing for. And it lost on the count of this so-called low-caste, ex-untouchable critique that civilization was simply an upper caste, romantic, utopian dream. Yeah? Sorry?
Is there any push to change that?
No. Politically, you wouldn't win it because the low-caste point of view is so dominant in political discourse that if I went and said, hey, look, let's bring back Gandhi's view, people will immediately say, what's your surname? And I'll say Chakrabarty and say, aren't you a Brahmin? And that'll silence me.
Thank you. I'm interested in, there are two nations that are sort of having a tremendous rise. Maybe not their populations are sharing it in it equally, but it seems that India, for one set of reasons, in China, for another set of reasons, are on quasi-parallel tracks. And are they? And if not, what is the likely impact of them being adjacent to each other and trying to achieve prominence or domination in the next era?
No, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. And I mean, within India, I can report more on the Indian discussions of this question, partly because the Chinese discussions are less accessible, both for reasons of language and other reasons. But on the one hand, there's a lot of effort on the part of India to engage China through business institutions, business contacts, cultural contacts. There's a university in Madras, which is a dedicated IT university, and there are 400 Chinese students actually studying there. But at the same time, India fears that the China will learn all the IT tricks from India and beat India hands down at the game. But the real problem is the boundary dispute. One real problem. So there's a whole state of India that China claims for itself. This is the state where the Dalai Lama was born. And every time Dalai Lama makes a visit there, or even when the Indian Prime Minister goes, China protests. How can you come into a disputed territory? India doesn't recognize it as disputed territory, and there's some hullabaloo over the last couple of days because the Google Maps showed it as disputed territory. And so this goes on all the time. There are always talk about Chinese massing their army on the frontier, so we should do that. Our Air Force being 1/3 the size of the Chinese Air Force and all that. There was also recently a case where a Chinese website produced a map of India balkanized into 30 different states and said, wouldn't it be better if India actually broke up into 30 different pieces? And then, of course, the Chinese official sources immediately said, that's not an official website. That's just somebody flying kites. And the Indian media says, but that's how China tests waters, you know. That's what they do. They get somebody unofficial to float an idea. There was a report in the Indian press. So if you look at the press, there's a lot of talk about mutual suspicion. But at the same time, on climate change, for instance, with respect to the Copenhagen negotiations, India and China are solidly on one side and actually have got exchanges going to discuss the climate change question. And so there is kind of apprehension that if China becomes a real superpower, which they will be, will they want a major power in their backyard? Or will they want to control it? And there's optimism that maybe China and India will have some sense of partnership in the game. So my own sense is that what needs to happen is that the border disputes needs to be settled. Because we don't have any historical any history of conflict with China as we have with Pakistan. There's not that kind of baggage of culture, religion. If anything, the ancient past is one of friendship and exchanges, as is the more recent past. And therefore, the real thorn is the border. And I think the border needs to be settled, and that will take care of a lot of problems. Thank you. Sure.
The nature of China's emergence seems to be more centered on manufacturing, and which gives jobs to more poor people, right? The nature of India's emergence seems to be more in the IT or high-tech area, which doesn't. And which one, in your opinion, seems to be a more sustainable model?
Well, see, this is where the economist argument come in, and that's where the people who favor globalization are saying to Indians, look at the Chinese model and do what they did. In other words, they made labor laws investor-friendly, which is an euphemism for saying that you should be able to hire and fire, do what you want to do with laborers, so that you put more capital in, right? And Indian labor laws, that's what I was saying, it's a legacy of another period, another kind of thinking. And that's the clash. Now, in India, it's harder to do it because you then go back to the same workers for votes. That's why there's a continuing tension between populist politics, which is all about getting votes and remembering the poor symbolically, and the actual reforms. And India hasn't quite worked out how to globalize in a manner that is internally civilized, nor has China. If you actually read detailed accounts about Chinese scramble for resources in Africa and Latin America, it's not a nice story, how they get their resources. And it's never been a nice story in anybody's capitalism. I mean, the West wasn't nice either to Africa, but now the Chinese are not being nice. And that's what I'm saying, that the civilizational message was that we will remain civilized, or we will become civilized as we become modern. Where the globalization message is, stop civilization for a while, let's become modern in an ugly way, and then we'll become civilized. Right? Yeah. Thank you.
I want to remind you that next Tuesday, our speaker will be on Gandhi. So any specific questions on Gandhi and Gandhi's view of globalization, we have Dr. Nadler coming from UC Berkeley. And the week after, on October the 13th, we have an economist who has written a book on India and China. So if you have specific questions on the economic paths that the two countries are traveling, we will have an expert, Dr. Asima Sinha from the University of Wisconsin. I hope you will join us both next Tuesday and the Tuesday after. But even more important, come for the cricket match and the great food on Saturday. There are books available. Bookstore is outside if you would like a copy. And again, please give a big hand to our speaker, Dr. Dipesh Chakrabarty.